So welcome everyone. Today we are joined by Dr. Maria Maust-Mohl, and she is going to share with us a talk about whales and hippos, who you might think, why on earth would we relate those two? But I think we are going to get the answers to that. Folks will be submitting questions, so Dr. Maria, we will ask you our questions at the end, if that's all right with you. Maria is an associate professor of psychology at Manhattan College, and DCP has been lucky enough to collaborate with her in a few different areas, but one writing chapters on communication with Dr. Dudzinski, and then also at our Bimini field site, both bringing groups, field courses and eco tours to Bimini, and then collaborating on research projects, particularly centered around the bottlenose dolphins here. So with that, I will pass it over to you. Thank you.
Great, thank you for the introduction. And I'm so excited to be sharing information with you guys today about hippos and whales. And just to tell you a little bit about maybe my interest in hippos are stemming from a couple important questions that'll be discussed today. The first, which you see in this little image here, which is actually a photograph I took while doing some of my research on hippos as a graduate student. Hippos are sort of unique in that they are considered an amphibious species. And the term amphibious is somewhat used interchangeably with the term semi-aquatic, which means these are animals that live both on land and in the water. But technically speaking, the term amphibious is a little bit different because it means that the hippos and other amphibious species require water to survive. And for hippos, what that means is they actually give birth to their young and nurse in the water. So that's one requirement for water. The second is for thermoregulation, which means how they regulate their body temperature. And hippos actually don't have sweat glands, and so they need the water to keep cool. So it's not surprising to see them, if you've seen pictures or been fortunate to see them in the wild, they spend most of the daytime hours in the water or in the mud to keep cool. And sometimes they'll actually go in the water at night as well. But that's part of the reason why they are considered amphibious. So that was one thing that I found really interesting about hippos. And the second thing, which is bringing us to today's topic, is the evolutionary connection between hippos and whales. And I was sort of surprised by this, the fact that scientists now think that hippos are the closest living relatives to cetaceans, which are our dolphins and whales. Years ago, scientists thought that hippos were actually more closely related to pigs and peccaries, but using a combination of fossil evidence, molecular and genetic data, they've shown pretty consistent results that hippos are the closest relatives to cetaceans. So here's the question. If they are related, what was their common ancestor like, right? Researchers, evolutionary biologists put together phylogenetic trees like you see here, which illustrate the relationships between different species and track their history to try to see how and why did they evolve, what adaptations, meaning what kind of specializations do they have that help them survive better in their environments, which we can use to build the story about the connection between species. And that's what I want to focus on today, are the connections between hippos and whales. What aspects of their behavior, what aspects of their adaptations do they share, and where are they different? And how does that tell us more about that amphibious lifestyle that they have? And so just to make sure that we're all on the same page first, I just wanted to go over a little bit more about the natural history of hippos versus cetaceans. So hippos first, we already know that they have this amphibious lifestyle. They spend time on land and in the water. And water is a requirement to them in terms of thermoregulation and also giving birth and nursing in the water. And although they are considered mainly herbivores that graze on land, there are reports of them occasionally foraging in the water on aquatic plants and also other animals. And that's probably a little bit more rare when there's food resources that maybe are scarce in the dry season. But they do occasionally eat in the water as well. So water is going to be an important thing for hippos that I want us to focus on. Some other aspects of their life history are they are mainly nocturnal, and this might also be due to some of that thermoregulation idea that I just talked about. If they need to be in the water to keep cool during the day, it's cooler at night. So that's when they typically move on land to graze and forage. When they move on land at night, they're typically more solitary, they're more alone, and they're just grazing. Sometimes you might see moms and calves or younger individuals together. I mentioned that they're herbivorous, right? They graze mostly on plants, and they are considered highly social, but yet we don't know that much about their social relationships. This is a big missing piece. You'll hear me saying that a lot because we really don't know that much about them. They're a very familiar species, and there's a lot of work being done on conservation and the ecology of hippos, but yet we know very little about their behavior and communication. But they are considered pretty social, especially in the water. If you see the picture on the top right, you do see very large groups of hippos doing something what's called rafting behavior. That's what they're doing there, where they're resting in the water, sometimes with their head on another hippo, sleeping and just taking it easy during the day, trying to stay cool. But if you look some more at their behavior in the water, that's where most of their social interactions actually occur. And there have been a few studies looking at their social relationships that show that they do form pretty strong affiliations, especially between the females and between females that are related. Typically, their social group consists of a dominant male who protects the rest of the female harem. And the other adult males tend to be a little bit more solitary. They are known to be very territorial. So you may have heard that hippos are the #1 killer of people in Africa, unfortunately, and that's mainly because they're very territorial. There are human-hippo conflicts that stem from humans unknowingly sometimes encroaching on their territories and habitats, and it's very difficult to see them in the murky water. And so that's a little bit about what we know with respect to hippos, but we're going to focus again more on that aquatic nature that they have and come back to some of the social questions a little bit later. So that's hippos. Now in comparison, let's talk a little bit about cetaceans. And this is really very basic information because cetaceans include whales and dolphins, which are a very diverse group. And of course, they represent our fully aquatic mammals. But in terms of the diversity of the number of species that are in this group, there is not surprisingly a lot of variation in their eating habits because we're talking about both baleen whales that have that modified keratin that they use to filter feed more or less, right, krill or other fish. They also include the toothed whales, right, that are more of like the dolphins, orcas, that have very different feeding strategies. So they have very diverse eating habits and activity patterns. But I think something that's consistently studied across a range of different cetaceans are, of course, their social behaviors and communication. They are highly social. They demonstrate a variety of complex communication, complex social relationships. They have cultural traditions. There's a lot of depth that we know about their social behavior, which again is sort of a disparity with what we know about hippos. So some of what we want to do in this comparison is remember that we still don't know enough about hippos to compare to the degree some of their behavior. So what I'm going to look at first in terms of the comparisons and the relationship between hippos and whales is to talk about some of their physiology, talk about some of their adaptations, focusing on that aquatic environment. Before doing that, I just wanted to give you a little bit more detail about what the evolutionary relationship looks like. And as I said from the beginning, there's pretty consistent evidence using the fossil record, molecular information, and also genetic information to show this hippo-whale connection. And what researchers are continuing to do, mainly using the fossil record, is to try to trace back their common ancestry. So here is where we can look at who is that common ancestor of hippos and whales. And what researchers seem to be suggesting, again using fossil records, are that that common ancestor is at least in part semi-aquatic. The fossils look like they may have had skulls and head shape that allowed them to actually submerge their heads in the water. And looking at their ear bones, they suggest that they may have had the capacity for underwater hearing. So it suggests that these common ancestors of hippos and whales were at least starting to enter the water, likely to obtain new food resources, because at the time, most mammals were terrestrial, they were land-based. So that meant these aquatic environments were kind of open territory for food resources. So their common ancestors were probably starting to shift back into the aquatic environment, at least for food. And then here came the hippo and whale lines, evolutionary lines. And so what we're going to see with that common ancestry idea in mind, if that ancestor was at least semi-aquatic, then hippos are kind of in this intermediate position of that transition to the aquatic environment, whereas cetaceans really went to the extreme of being fully aquatic. Okay, so we'll think some more about the common ancestry questions later on, because we don't know, of course, all the answers, but there's an interesting story being built using the fossil record, using their behavior, using communication, using their adaptations to really show the strength of the relationship between hippos and whales. So let's first look at the aquatic adaptations of the hippopotamus. And they do spend a lot of time in water, as we already know. It's very important for their survival. A sort of disclaimer, though, is that they don't actually swim in the water. If you look at their movement in water, they are often seen kind of walking along the bottom, or they push off and glide through the water. And something that helps them do that is that they evolved an adaptation, a specialization that allows for heavier limb bones, denser limb bones, maybe to help them sink. Their bodies are pretty buoyant. If you've seen their body shape, they are kind of tubular, in shape, and they do have a lot of blubber, so they are fairly buoyant. They can float pretty well, but the dense limb bones is thought to help them sink to the bottom. So when they're moving through the water, it's easier, because they can't actually swim, to move while submerged. So the diagram that you see from an article by Fisher and colleagues, the middle diagram is the hippo limb or leg bone, which you see comparatively to what is on the left is an ox leg, and on the right is a pig leg. The hippo has a much broader, thicker limb bone, which is believed to help them sink better. If you look at their feet too, which you see in the bottom, a cute little picture there of an adult and a calf moving in the water, they have partially webbed feet. So if you think about what a duck foot looks like, having that webbing is really beneficial for moving, swimming through the water. Now we're talking about partial webbed feet, so it's not fully webbed, but it could also help them push themselves through the water. Their skin is mostly hairless. They do have some hair, but it's definitely not to the degree that we see other like ungulate type species. The last couple ones are going to be the more important ones I'm going to focus on in terms of aquatic adaptations. What we mean by valvular nostrils and ears has to do with how they submerge in the water. They can actually close off their ears, actually fold their ears back when they submerge, and there's a little valve, they think, in there that helps prevent water from flooding the ears. And what's more important, though, of course, if they're submerging their heads, is having the ability to close their nostrils. So it closes as a valve to prevent water from entering their respiratory tract. So they have valvular nostrils. They also have some other adaptations or modifications to the respiratory tract that help prevent that incursion from water. So they can close their mouth, they can close their nostrils. But if you've ever seen them, I know I've seen pictures of this at aquariums sometimes, or zoos, that hippos can actually sit underwater with their mouth fully open. And sometimes there are cleaner fish or cichlids that actually move in and out of the hippo mouth and clean their teeth. So if that's another case of preventing water from fully entering the respiratory tract and lungs, they also may have something in the back of their throat that helps close off the mouth and the rest of the respiratory tract from water entering. So we'll talk some more about that in a second, because in comparison to whales, there's some interesting similarities there. The last point is kind of a question mark, because it's another case of missing information. We don't know that much about how hippos are sensing their environment with respect to hearing. We know that their common ancestor, right, the common ancestor of hippos and whales, may have had some capacity for underwater hearing. And what we know, at least behaviorally with hippos, there was a previous study done by Barclough with hippos in the wild that involved what's called a playback study. So playing sounds back to the hippos to see if they would respond. He did this and showed that they do respond by orienting in the direction of the sound or reacting behaviorally, which suggests they do actually hear sounds underwater. It hasn't been further tested, so it's still a question mark, but given what we're going to talk some more about in terms of what they're doing in the water, it wouldn't be surprising that they can hear underwater. Now, in comparison, let's look at just some of the basic, again, because this is a very diverse group of cetaceans, some of their aquatic adaptations. So in comparison of body shape, remember hippos are more tubular, whereas our cetaceans are more streamlined. They have that torpedo shape that helps them move through the water. It's very hydrodynamic. They also don't have hair, with the exception, I know with dolphins, for example, when they're first born, they do have a little mustache, little hairs that are there early on that then disappear later in life. They have modified limbs. They have fins and tail flukes for swimming, of course. And not to get into all the detail of diving physiology, but many of our marine mammals do dive very deep in the ocean. So they have the ability to, accommodate the pressure that happens when they're deep under the surface of the ocean due to their lungs and breathing capabilities. There are differences in heart rate and respiration. Some of, like sperm whales, for example, can hold their breath for I think up to 90 minutes. So there are really sophisticated specializations, of course, that are occurring in our fully aquatic mammals that we don't see to the same degree in hippos. But as I mentioned with hippos at the end, some of these questions about their respiratory tract are particularly interesting because there are some similarities. If you look at the head, as you see in the image here of dolphins, what happened, they think evolutionarily, is that the skull became elongated. And what happened with the nostrils that now are our blowholes in our cetaceans is that they went from being at the front of the head to migrating to the dorsal or top side of the head. And in our toothed whales, they have a single blowhole, but in our baleen whales, they have two blowholes. And we're going to look at that in a second. But if those nostrils have migrated to the top, it allows for easier breathing for our fully aquatic mammals, right? If they're surfacing, they only have to stick their head just barely above the surface, open the blowhole, breathe out, breathe in, and then go back down. Because of course, they need to breathe air as mammals. And so there is a bit of a difference there in the positioning of their nostrils and blowholes in comparison to hippos, but we'll talk some more about that dorsal positioning and some more about their modifications to the respiratory tract. Okay, so we're seeing that there is a difference between hippos and whales and their adaptations, and hippos are not fully aquatic, clearly. They're not even semi-aquatic. They're in this, intermediate state of that amphibious lifestyle, but I think some of what you'll see coming up is that they are a little bit more aquatic than maybe we previously thought. So let's take a look at the nostrils of the hippos in comparison to cetaceans. So this is something I focused on some of my colleagues to do a comparison in two ways. First, looking at the external surfaces of the nostrils. So here you see side-by-side comparisons on the left of the hippo. Then you see a humpback whale in the middle, and then the bottlenose dolphin on the right. And remember, we already talked about how evolutionarily for cetaceans, the nostrils migrated farther back on the head and clearly on that dorsal surface to allow them, and when they're surfacing, to breathe more easily. Hippos' nostrils are more anterior, which means that it's more on the front of their head, but they are more on the dorsal side of it. So when they're resting in that amphibious position, which is the first picture I showed you guys, where their head is at the surface of the water, but in a way that their eyes, their ears, their nostrils are above the surface, but their mouth, their throat, the rest of their body is below the surface, having their nostrils positioned in a slightly dorsal way makes it easier for them to breathe. So that's one thing to note, the dorsal position. The second thing to note is the shape. The hippo nostril has a sort of crescent, shape to it, which looks pretty similar to the humpback whale, which also has a crescent shape to it. The the dolphin blowhole is a little bit more oval or circular, so it does have a little bit of a different shape, which some of these comparisons might suggest that hippo and baleen whales have more similar nostril blowhole comparisons. But the shape is something that's important, but also how they close it, how they open and close it. So you see not only the side-by-side of those three species, but also the different positions when they are open versus closed. So we know from the earlier slide about aquatic adaptations that hippos have these valvular nostrils, like cetaceans. They can close them to prevent water from entering when they're submerged. But what's interesting about how they open and close their nostrils, which is actually similar to cetaceans, are that they have to use muscles to open the nostrils. So when they're going to breathe, they are actively using muscles to open the nostrils, and then they are closed at rest, which is opposite if you think about our own nose. I mean, we can't close our nose. We're a terrestrial, species. Our nostrils are always open. We might be able to flare them a little bit, but they don't close. And what's different here as an important aquatic adaptation, and this is consistent across, many marine species, that they have evolved this sort of default resting position for the nostrils to be closed. So they don't need muscle action to close. They need muscle action to open. And that was sort of surprising to us with the hippos because they are often seen as more land-based. Maybe they're just resting, hanging out in the water to keep cool. But the fact that their nostrils and the way that they control them is very similar to cetaceans is, again, something interesting about their ancestral history with cetaceans. So they are closed at rest. They have similar positions. And when we did a comparison across not just our hippo and cetacean species, but also a range of different aquatic, semi-aquatic, and then terrestrial animals, it's interesting. I think that that comparison stands out more, so the importance of what it means for a nostril to be closed at rest. So if we look first on the right, this is actually my dog, Abby. She's a Jack Russell mix. Right? Domestic dogs like us are fully terrestrial, and those nostrils are open. That's their typical position. There are some sort of unusual cases of terrestrial species like a camel that can close their nostrils a little bit, and this is believed to be an adaptation beneficial for their desert environment that they live in. If there happens to be a dust storm, closing your nostril to prevent dust from entering your respiratory system is beneficial. But the way that they close it, they think, is using muscles. So they have to actively use their muscles to close the nostril, but at rest, they're open. So the terrestrial position for nostrils is open. The aquatic condition or position for nostrils, the default, the resting position is closed. If you think about the two now semi-aquatic, we've got a harbor seal, and the fully aquatic West Indian manatee. Their nostrils are closed at rest. They have to actively open the nostrils with muscles to breathe. And so that, again, is argued to be an important adaptation for these aquatic species when they're submerged to prevent water from entering the respiratory system. So more information that we now know, that's supportive of the evolutionary connections of hippos and supporting that idea that maybe their ancestor, their common ancestor, was semi-aquatic and may have had some of these adaptations. It's of course hard to trace that history. So we looked at the external surfaces of the nostrils, but we also looked at the internal components of the respiratory passage. And what's interesting to note about our cetaceans are that they have an internal nasal plug. And what we're comparing here is a hippo to a minke whale. And another mechanism for helping to prevent water from entering the respiratory system is to have this internal nasal plug that actually moves into position and fully seals internally the respiratory tract. So again, it's a secondary system for preventing water from entering the lungs and their breathing. Now, hippos also, interestingly, have a type of nasal plug. You can see it's much smaller. It's not as prominent. It doesn't stick out as much. But it is there and is argued to be another mechanism for them to help prevent water from entering their respiratory passage. So we're learning a lot more about what kind of adaptations hippos have, how similar or different they are. We also looked at some of the musculature that's involved in how they control both the nasal plug, but also the outside surfaces of the nostrils. And they are very similar in terms of how they are positioned and the actions involved, which again tells more about the similarities and the aquatic adaptations that hippos have to their cetacean relatives. So that's what we know more or less anatomically about hippos, and especially the the respiratory tract ideas. And I want to shift gears now to focus a little bit on their behavior and communication. Now we know hippos, like cetaceans, are very social, so it's not surprising that they do use communication to stay in contact with the rest of their social group. But because they are in that intermediate position of both being land and water, there's some interesting evidence about their communication systems that support that intermediate position. So some of what I had also done previously is studying their combined behavior and communication. And what had been reported previously by the researcher Barclow in the field was that hippos have the ability to produce sound in air, underwater, and simultaneously in both. So here's another key part of what that amphibious species represents. So if we think about that head position, if their head's above the surface, they might only transmit sound in air. If they're submerged, they might only transmit sound underwater. If their head is in that surface position, that amphibious position, they can simultaneously transmit sound above and below. And we, through our research, found that they do produce a variety of different kinds of sounds in the different contexts. And we're continuing to learn more about the function of those calls. They do seem to be connected to the social interactions between hippos. And in fact, one of the most common calls that you hear from hippos, if you've seen documentary shows or if you've had the chance to see them in the field, you often hear them make what's called a wheeze honk call. And it's called a wheeze honk because it sounds like a wheeze honk, 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 honk. So they do this to stay in contact with the rest of their social group. And I'm going to show you a little video clip, hopefully it'll play, to show you a group of female hippos. This is from Disney's Animal Kingdom, where it's very common for the wheeze honk to be produced in a way that is simultaneously transmitted above and below the surface, with the benefit of staying in contact with individuals that might be above, underwater, or also at the surface. And in fact, in the video, you can see some of the hippos surfacing and doing a chorus, meaning that many of them vocalize that wheeze honk. And it seems to have that, affiliative contact, benefit for staying in touch with the rest of the social group, perhaps to alert everybody in your group of what's going on. So here's what the wheeze honk sounds like. Okay, I hope you guys could hear it, but it is a very common sound. It's very loud. It resonates, very deeply, both underwater and in air. And what we did through some of our recordings is not just record the behavior on video, but we had a microphone recording sounds in air and a hydrophone, an underwater microphone, recording sounds underwater. And we could look at images like this. This is called a spectrogram, where you can create a visual image of the sounds to analyze the different components of the call, the frequency ranges, the duration, but also importantly here for whether it was transmitted only in air, only underwater, or simultaneously in both. So this is a good image to show you guys just as that simultaneous amphibious sound of things occurring both in air and underwater, which has that benefit of conveying information to the rest of your social group. And this is a little bit unique. There aren't very many species besides, I think I've seen some evidence in alligators or crocodiles that have this potential for simultaneous sound being transmitted above and below the surface. Some of our cetaceans, do obviously communicate fully underwater. Some of them can produce sounds in air as well, but it's something a little bit different in terms of the function of what hippos are doing. So the simultaneous amphibious sound is a bit unique, but maybe attributed to that intermediate position. Something else sort of surprising about hippo communication is that when we looked overall at the sounds they produce, the majority of them are actually produced solely underwater. Even though there's the benefit I talked to you about with the simultaneous amphibious sound, the majority of their sounds are occurring underwater, which if you're standing by the surface, you don't actually hear all of this vocalizing going on underwater. And because they live in such murky environments, you can't even often see what they're doing. It seems clear that they're interacting, but it's not clear, what all these sounds mean in terms of social interaction. So it's another missing piece of what these sounds actually mean socially, but they clearly have some kind of social function. And it's interesting, again, that they are producing the majority of their calls underwater. And these are just some examples of the different call types that they make, which include, this is called a groan, a grunt, a scream, a whine, and then here's that wheeze honk, which they can actually do a wheeze honk solely underwater as well. So again, there's more going on under the surface with hippos than we might expect. The last thing I want to talk to you guys about is something that has also been reported in the field previously, but something we wanted to follow up on with our research, to look at another category of sounds that hippos produce, which are these pulsed sounds. And so what we recorded in our study was a variety of different pulse sounds that occur underwater, but one interesting category that they're using are click trains, which is a repeated pulse sound underwater that seems to be occurring when hippos are moving actively underwater, perhaps searching. And there are two main types of click trains. There is what we call a broadband click train because it has this broad kind of frequency range in the click train. And then there are the narrow band, or otherwise known as the low frequency click trains. So they produce both types, and it's difficult for us to know for sure if these are distinct types or if it's an artifact of the way that we did our recording. So I only used one hydrophone under the surface. So we may have missed some of those higher frequencies due to the methods of how we recorded. But nonetheless, we have two different types of click trains, and this is what they sound like. Here is the broadband click train. You might think that that sounds like bubbles. And they do sometimes produce click trains underwater because they're only produced underwater. Sometimes when they would produce click trains, they would have a little bubble stream. But they can also produce clicks without bubbles. And so we know it's not just the bubble noise that's occurring. This is an actual type of click train that can occur without bubbles. The emission of bubbles might just be part of how they're producing sounds, but we actually really don't know much about how they're producing sounds. Is it coming out the nostrils? Is it coming from the larynx? That we don't know yet. And here is the second type of click train. This is the narrow band. Okay, I hope you guys could hear that. It's much lower in frequency. It almost sounds like a knocking sound. That was very common for us to record. But what was interesting is, one, that these sounds were only occurring in the water and when hippos seemed to be searching. So we designed an experiment to test if it's possible that hippos might be using these click trains as a type of echolocation. So if you know information about our toothed whales especially, they use echolocation in order to navigate, detect prey, a variety of different purposes. And so just a little background on dolphin echolocation, again, in comparison to hippos, dolphin echolocation clicks often have that broadband nature, right? Higher frequencies and lower frequencies, and they're often at frequencies that are even beyond our hearing range in the ultrasonic frequency. So there's a lot of detailed information that they can extract from those click trains that they send out. What they do is they generate those clicks in the nasal passageway, coming from these nasal sacs. They get sent out through the melon on their forehead, that fatty tissue that exists there. It gets sent out into their environment, and those clicks actually bounce off of objects and create an echo that then travels back to the dolphin and is able to be received in their jawbone. So that's how they use echolocation. It's a very sophisticated, sensory system that allows them to navigate in the dark. It allows them to find prey, to find other dolphins, maybe even for some communication. There's a lot of different ideas, but definitely for navigation and prey detection. So the question is, are hippos doing something similar? And just for comparison, here's what dolphin click trains sound like. Okay, so they are a little bit louder than what we're hearing for hippos. They have a broader frequency range, so it's much more specialized than we might expect for hippos, but yet, it's interesting to think about whether hippos are using it in some kind of functional way. There it is again, sorry. So our hypothesis from our experiment is that hippos might be using those click trains in a sort of rudimentary echo ranging kind of way, which means it's not to the detail that that dolphins or bats might use echolocation for really finding detailed information about prey or the things in their environment. This might be a very basic system, especially if those clicks are really low in frequency, because the lower frequency information isn't going to result in that much detail coming back in the echo. It might only be used for something like finding obstacles in the lakes or rivers that hippos inhabit, or detecting another hippo, which are pretty large, or a crocodile. So it's not going to be used for very detailed information, but might help them navigate the murky water they live in. And so that's what we're hypothesizing about for the hippo click trains, that they might be used as this rudimentary type of echo ranging ability. And an interesting comparison that you see here being mentioned, that they've studied echolocation development in dolphins. And when dolphins are first born, within a few days, they start producing first click trains that are actually really low in frequency. And they look very similar. This is side by side. Here's the hippo on the left. Here's the young dolphin on the right. They structurally look very similar. And researchers think that those early clicks that dolphins are producing might facilitate very basic echo ranging, something like finding mom, staying in close proximity, maybe basic navigation, not very detailed information. But then, of course, as dolphins develop, those clicks become broader in frequency, and they have a more specialized ability for detection. So it's possible that hippos might be using echolocation. Our study is compelling in the results, but we still need more conclusive evidence of whether they are truly using it as a type of echolocation. But it's another case of the interesting connections that we're seeing between cetaceans and hippos, building the story, of course, that they are doing a lot more in the water. They are more aquatic in terms of their adaptations, the nostril, the respiratory tract. The vocalizations they produce are predominantly underwater. They might have this echo ranging ability that helps them navigate underwater. There's definitely a lot more similarities there than we thought previously, that again supports the strong relationship between hippos and cetaceans. So in conclusion, I just want to say, reiterate what I guess just said, in the sense that what we've seen through the behavior and adaptation comparisons are the hippos are more aquatic, but they still don't have the specializations that cetaceans do for being fully aquatic. So they're still in that intermediate transition to being in an aquatic environment. But there's still lingering questions, of course, about their common ancestor. They were perhaps at least semi-aquatic, but could they hear underwater? Did they echolocate? What were their vocalizations like? Were they produced on land or in the water? And much of that we'll never know, because of course that information isn't fossilized. But yet building evidence using combination of all these methods helps us gain more perspective on what their evolutionary relationships might be like. And there's, of course, a lot more to be known about hippos. What are the functions of their vocalizations? What are the click trains really being used for? More information about their social relationships. What else are they doing in the water? There was a lot I couldn't see, even studying them in zoos, because the water isn't always very clear. So it's difficult to see how they're interacting under the surface. And just as an anecdote, I put a picture on here of hippos in the ocean, which was kind of a surprise. This is a picture from National Geographic of hippos in Gabon, who apparently go into the ocean and seem to be surfing in the waves. And the question is, what are they doing? Right? They're probably not looking for food, because they don't typically eat in the water, and they definitely wouldn't be finding the aquatic plants that they normally eat or could eat in lakes and rivers. Are they just playing? What are they doing in the water? What are they doing in the ocean? There's a lot more we need to know about them, and I think it's an exciting time to be studying hippos and learning more about them, and definitely, again, comparing them to cetaceans to really see that relationship that they have and what it means to be aquatic. So I thank you guys for participating and listening in today, and of course I welcome any questions.
Thank you. We have several questions. One, I would like to preface with that I don't know anything about cognition studies with hippos, but so there is an assumption in this question. If hippos are closely related to dolphins, why are hippos not known to be particularly smart? Is hippos' intelligence underestimated, or did they just miss out on the cetaceans' development of their brain over time?
It's a good question. And part of my answer is just going to be, I don't think we know yet. I do think a big challenge with hippos is motivation. Because we, even in doing the experiment that I talked to you about, I didn't explain all the details, but the way that we tested the click trains was to train them to search for a food item, which we started on land and then transferred it to the water to see if they would still search for food underwater. Carrots conveniently would sink underwater, so we could hide them in the pool and see if the hippo would search for it. But some of them just had no interest in even searching for food. And so I think some of it could be motivation, but I don't know enough about their cognition or even studies looking at their brain that would answer that question more effectively, but it's definitely another missing piece. But the separation of hippos and cetaceans, there is a good gap in the history that we know as well, that there's a lot of unknowns about the in-between of what happened as hippos evolved on their own and as cetaceans evolved on their own, that could, may have just been a divergence in those cognitive abilities. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. A quicker question, I think, do they have any natural predators that might drive their motivation or lack thereof?
Crocodiles are really the only thing I think that prey on them, and it's usually their young. When they're adults, I don't think crocodiles do prey on them, so it's only the calves. Otherwise, it tends to be humans. They are poached because they have ivory in their canines. So sometimes they, are culled by humans because of the conflict in territories, or poached for the canines, the ivory in their canines.
Humans. We have two questions related to the vocalizations. So first, are the vocalizations that are simultaneously produced that you were talking about in air and underwater, is that it sounded to me, now I'm deviating from the question, but that was purposeful. How did you determine that it was purposeful and not just the placement of the animal's head?
It's a good question. I think some of it has to do with the fact that some of the sounds, can just be transmitted underwater. And so the wheeze honk call, being an important contact call for connections between the social group, they do tend to surface before they make the call, which seems to suggest a purpose of the positioning to better convey that information to individuals that might be in different positions. So looking at the behavioral context of the vocalizations is one piece that I think can help evaluate the purpose of it. I don't think it's just an artifact, of what they're doing, and just by chance their head position might result in this simultaneous transmission. I do think it has an important function for keeping in contact with individuals in different positions, because even though they do tend to stay in the water to keep cool, during the day you do see hippos moving on land, maybe fighting on land over territories, different things going on. And so I think there is a purpose to that simultaneous amphibious sound. Good question.
Thank you. And a technical question. What is the fundamental frequency of the hippo clicks?
It varies. It is pretty low, and if I remember correctly, I can go back. I don't know if you can see it. Oh, I can't go back. Strange. There it goes. There it is. I want to say for both the click train types, it was closer to like 200 hertz. But it varies a lot, and that's not something we measured, for every single click train type, because I think there is an issue with, as I mentioned, like the orientation of the hippo in reference to the hydrophone, which is a problem that could be addressed in further research.
Our work is never done. Given that, getting now away from sound production, given that the hippo also has to engage the muscles to open the nostril, do they fully go to sleep, or do they do the hemisphere sleeping like dolphins? Or do we know?
There is one study out more recently that I think suggests they might have some ability for hemispheric sleep, but not surprisingly, it doesn't seem as specialized as cetaceans. But it does seem like they utilize some kind of system that's similar, but it's sort of inconclusive, because I think there are two studies out now that I think about it. One that suggests that they don't, and one that suggests that they do. So I think the jury's still out on it, but I don't think it would be surprising if they do have some ability for that hemispheric sleep. But most of the time when I've seen them resting, they will raft on another hippo, or rest their head on like a shallow area in the water, or actually on the side of like a lake or something, so their head is actually resting on something more solid, so there's less risk of them submerging if they happen to fall asleep. So it's difficult to know, for sure. Good question.
We have two more questions. One has lots of parts, so I'll ask the quicker one first. What are the zoos where you've studied the hippos? Where did you do the research? I heard you mention one, but we didn't know if it was multiple facilities.
Yes, most of the work was done at Disney's Animal Kingdom, because there's sort of unique in the amount of space that they have, but also they had a group when I had done this work of 16, which was a very good sample size for research. I also did some work though at the Adventure Aquarium in Camden, New Jersey, which is a little bit closer to home for me since I'm in New York. But there are only 2 hippos there. So some of the follow-up that we did on the nostril comparisons and a little bit more of the echolocation work was done at the Adventure Aquarium as well.
And then I sort of saved this one because I feel like it has a lot of parts, so you can pick out whichever parts you want. So going back to the births and nursing for the hippo being aquatic, why do they do those things in the water? And like with dolphins, we're always thinking about how they're born tail first, so the blowhole is last, which is convenient if you're an air-breathing creature in the sea, but that seems really tricky for a 4-legged creature. So we had some questions about why they give birth and nurse in the water, and then also where do they mate?
Good questions. And part of my disclaimers are that I don't know that I've seen much evidence. Let me stick with the mating question first. I think in terms of reproduction, there hasn't, and it's been a little while since I've looked at this, I guess, but to my knowledge, there weren't any actual observations of hippos mating. So how and where it occurs, we don't really know, but I would suspect it could occur on land or in the water, as far as I would predict. In terms of giving birth in the water, what tends to happen for the females is they tend to kind of isolate themselves from the rest of the group. Infanticide does occur in hippos, and it's likely attributed to the dominant male and fierce competition for access to females and reproduction. So females tend to isolate themselves in shallow areas where they give birth. And part of, I think, the hypothesis for why they do or have evolved this ability to give birth in the water is for protection from predators like lions, who I don't think prey on adult hippos or even really calves if the calves are in the water. Crocodiles are a potential predator, but if they are in these kind of secluded, shallow areas where the female can protect the calf, I think there's a greater likelihood of survival, but still risk, of predation on by the crocodiles. But that's the best explanation I've heard for why they give birth in the water, just for, predation, protection. But in terms of, observations of it, it's pretty rare, both in terms of mating and giving birth. There's not a lot that's been reported in the literature about it.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you for giving us this talk. Thank you for fielding the questions. I hope everybody who joined in, I hope that you enjoyed the talk. Maria, do we have those wrap-up slides? So I'll just point this out to folks, especially if anyone is new today. And I know some people came in late today, which is fine. But if you want to see upcoming schedules and recorded webinars, they are on our website under the Education tab. You can also find them on our YouTube channel, Dolphin Communication Project. And of course, if you want to subscribe to that channel, then you'll get your notifications. And the next slide will just remind folks of other opportunities to learn. So our podcast is the Dolphin Pod. If you haven't already listened to all of our archived episodes, you can find that wherever you get your podcasts. And then our webinars are going to continue for a little while longer. We may take a break in the summer and then pick up again. But next Tuesday, we have another webinar with Terry at the Roatan Institute for Marine Sciences. So you want to bring your bottlenose dolphin questions to that. And that is geared toward younger kids. So go ahead and if your kids need a break from summer and they want to come listen, do that. And then next Thursday is an older class, a Dives Deep program on marine debris. And there's no set homework, there's no set assignment for that. But if you want to think about what do you think of when you hear marine debris and why does it really matter other than like litter is bad? So we're going to be joined by a DCP colleague to discuss that. And then lastly, of course, you know how to support us on that last slide. And we are continuing for a little while longer to do our Pay It Forward campaign. So for every $15 spent on the website on those starred items, you can choose a person to receive an Adopt a Wild Dolphin electronic kit, just to say thank you for their hard work or cheer them up in this crazy time. And then keep track of us on the website and email and social media. And we hope that you enjoyed this and our other webinars, and we hope to see you again soon. So a big thank you, Maria. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you guys for participating. Thanks for inviting me.
Thanks everyone for your questions and your participation. Hope you all have a great day.